Hi, my name is Tom Hanlon. I'm an instructor at Event Store. Today I'm going to walk you through the steps needed to provision an Event Store cluster in the Azure environment. Before we get started, here's a list of prerequisites. All right then, let's provision our cluster. Here is a list of the tasks we will be performing. Note that the yellow tasks are performed in the Event Store Cloud Console. Note that the blue tasks are performed in the Azure console. Task 1. Read the docs. The process we will be following is well documented in the following location. You want to go to the developer's site. You want to select Event Store Cloud. After selecting Event Store Cloud, you want to choose Get Started. After you choose Get Started, there's a left navigation panel. And the steps we'll be following are outlined in the provisioning section. There are specific documentations for each cloud. We'll be following the Azure steps. Step 2. Create a project in the Event Store Cloud. In order to create a cluster, we first need a project. Within your organization, you can have one or more projects. It's within the projects that we create our clusters, our networks, and the peering connection that we need. In order to create a new project, you give the project a name. You have the option of adding administrators for the project. And then you click Create. Next step, create a network in the Event Store Cloud Console. Your cluster will be created in a network, so the first step is to create that network. Note that there is this helpful collection of breadcrumb trail across the top, highlighting the steps that you need to perform. You want to choose your cloud provider, choose a region to deploy the cluster, and then go ahead and create the network. The network obviously needs a name, so you will have to name the network. Note that the network will go from provisioning for a few moments, and then it will move to the state of available. Next step, create a cluster in the Event Store Cloud Console. Choose Create New Cluster. Give the cluster a name. Choose which network you'd like to deploy the cluster in. This will be the network we just created. You get to choose the version. I'm going to choose a long-term support version. That happens to be Event Store DB 2310. You get to choose whether or not to enable system and user projections. I'm going to enable both. For demonstration purposes, a micro instance is fine. Obviously, for production purposes, you'd want a machine with much more capacity. For production also, you would want to use a 3-node cluster. But for this example, I'm going to use a single node When you are done, click Create Cluster in the lower right. Note that after creating the cluster, it will be in provisioning state for a few moments before it switches over to available. Next step, create a network in the Azure console. In order to create a network in Azure, I tend to start up here at the top, All Resources, create a resource, choose Networking, then choose Create a Virtual Network. You need to choose or create a resource group for this resource. You need to give the network a name. You want to validate that the network's being created in the proper region. And then go through the validation and creation process. Next step, create network peering in the Event Store Cloud Console. To create the peering connection in the Event Store console, you will need to have both the Event Store console window open and the Azure console. We need to copy and paste some information. The first thing we're going to need is our tenant ID. You can get this from going to Active Directory, which is now called Entra, and get your tenant ID. Then we need our peer network ID, and we will go over to our resources, and we want to find our network. And then we want to get our network ID. You can choose Properties here, but note that copying the network ID here in the Properties panel will not work. So I'm crossing that out. What you want to do is click in the top right, the JSON view of the configuration. Clicking on that will expose the network ID in the form that we need for Event Store. So copy the value of the ID field in this JSON document and take that information over to the Event Store Cloud Console and enter that value in as peer network ID. Make sure the region's properly selected. Note that we need to copy over the CIDR range as well. And you can grab that from the informational console there. You don't need the JSON view, and copy that there. Next step, create a service principal in the Azure console. When you create the peering in the Event Store console, a checklist of steps will appear. We're going to run each of these commands one at a time. The first is to run this command to create an Azure service principal. Copy that command over, open up a terminal in the Azure console, and paste that command into the Cloud Shell. Next step, create a role in the Azure console. Now that we've created our service principal, we need to create a role and then assign that role. The first step, right, is going to be to take the role definition JSON and put it in a file in the Azure Cloud Console. Next step, assign the role to the service principal. Take this command and execute it in the Azure Cloud Console. And we now have a service principal with a role assigned to it that can be used for our peering connection. Next step, create a virtual machine instance in Azure. Since our application will involve virtual machines or other services running within the network that we created in Azure, we can test our functionality by first creating a virtual machine, logging into it to see if we can connect to our cluster. So we want to create a resource, choose a virtual machine. I'm going to create a Linux instance. Since this instance won't be doing much more than accepting an SSH request and executing a curl command, we don't need to create a large instance here. Give the machine a name. Specify that you want to launch it in the network that we've created. I already have a key pair, right? So I'm going to use that key pair. The instructions are fairly straightforward for creating a key pair if you don't have one. Azure processes sometimes go through a two-step where they review your configuration for correctness before they give you the option to create. This configuration has passed the validation, so we can go ahead and create it. Next step, connect to the virtual machine instance using SSH. In order to connect to the instance, find your instance in the Azure Control Panel. Once you have found the instance, there will be an SSH connection option. So from this page, you would click on Connect. And once you choose Connect, we're going to choose native SSH. And then it will generate a connection string for you, asking for the name of your key pair. So this SSH command should be able to connect through to our instance. And as we see here, the connection is successful. Next step, verify connectivity to the Event Store cluster. All that we need, right, is the IP address or the host names of our Event Store cluster. So you want to go to, the Event Store Cloud, click on your cluster, and choose Connect to Test Cluster. Note that this is a web application, so it will give us the information we need, but the attempts to connect from our browser through to the server will not succeed. But we can grab the connection string and copy it over into our network and the instance in that network where it will succeed. Now this is a client connection string, so we need to change it somewhat. We're going to change it to a HTTP request using curl, right, instead of a client connect string that we would use in this case in .NET. So we're going to change the first part of the URL from ESDB to HTTPS. And then the last part we're going to change to /gossip. The gossip protocol is what nodes in the cluster use to communicate with each other about their status. So this should return some content to us that will verify that we can see the cluster and that our application could connect through to it. Congratulations! You've created a cluster and verified connectivity to that cluster. Now that you've created a cluster in the Event Store Cloud, I would encourage you to go to academy.eventstore.com and check out some of the courses we have there. In particular, the From Scratch courses are very useful for helping you get started with any of these 4 programming languages. These include connecting to the cluster, adding your first event, and reading that event